complicated, you know, man. I got dang old Rubik's Cube, man. You like talking about blue, red, man, then you get to one side and like messed up.
All right, Yuukimaru, welcome to the Jay Burden Show. How are you doing, man?
Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you on. So as I do from time to time, I kind of just put out a post, you know, to kind of to the winds and basically ask, like, who do you want to appear on my show? And you were recommended by several of my mutuals. And so I, you know, after I got that recommendation, I checked out some of your essays and I really enjoyed them a lot. So for someone who isn't familiar with you, kind of how would you describe who you are and what you do on the internet?
I am a guy who writes anonymously, and I write mostly articles that are related to strategy for the dissident right.
So I'm curious, how did you end up on the dissident right? I mean, I know that you mentioned a little bit before that you were kind of assuming people come out of, you know, a more libertarian framework. Is that where you came from, or did you find another route?
I was actually dissident from the day one. Like, I got kicked out of kindergarten when I was 4 years old, and when I went to second one, everyone was sleeping at 10 a.m. and I never could, and staff hated me because I was just not sleeping. I was making problems while all the other kids were doing what they were supposed to do.
It's funny you bring that up because they're kind of, I had similar stories about me at that age. I think that if you make it this far, you have to be kind of a troublemaker. From a
yeah. You have to be gifted in a controversial way.
Right, exactly. If you're too agreeable, you would have quit a long time ago.
Yeah.
So the article I want to talk about is an article you wrote on a website called Resistance Protocols. And the title of the article is An Introduction to Bio-conservatism. So do you want to describe what that phrase bio-conservatism means?
Yeah. So the basic idea is we want to conserve not some institution, not some tradition, but most importantly, humans as they are from the technology for artificial genetic modification. We want humans to remain in large part a product of creation or chance, depending on your philosophical beliefs, but we don't want them to be a manufactured product.
Well, and that's interesting because, you know, when you think of people like Yuval Harari, the kind of, I don't even know what you'd call that faction, but I guess we call them transhumanists, right?
I call them extinctionists. And the reason I use that word is because word trans means to change from one shape to another. And that's really not what they want. They don't want to turn humans into upgraded humans. They want to completely erase humans and replace us with machines.
Well, and it's kind of an interesting premise, right? The idea that you can change what it is to be a human and still keep that essential like human nature to it. And I think that it's sort of this like materialist reduction. The idea, and you see this in like Reddit circles, where it's essentially the idea that, you know, that you're nothing but a computer program in a meat suit. You know, the idea that you can completely change that meat suit, quote unquote, and be left with kind of the same consciousness, I guess.
Well, I'm not sure, and I'm not particularly interested like how many components of what it means to be a human being cannot be copied. What I focus on is that the aspect of human being that can be copied by machine is the aspect of being able to perform a job. When we study how modern techno-industrial system works, what we find is that increasingly every part is specialized for a specific task, and the same logic is applied to human beings. As the time goes on, as the techno-industrial system advances, human beings become more specialized for a specific job. And the whole conversation about whether AI can become truly general intelligence, I don't think it's particularly important. I think we are already screwed even without that. I think we are in big trouble just because the system doesn't need a lot of general intelligence. It just needs each part to perform its duty. Each machine only needs to be better than a human being at a specific job in order for humans to be replaced for the most part.
That's an interesting point. And kind of in that, right, when you have this idea of kind of pure technique, right, that everything is essentially an optimization problem, there is no way within the logic of that system to essentially pull back from transhumanism, or you say kind of extinction. You know, that there is no way within that logic, because it is fundamentally less efficient to use a human in a role where a machine would do it better. And so you draw this distinction between soft and hard bioconservatives. And so the idea of the hard bioconservatives is accelerationists. You know, it's something that you'd see in Kaczynski or Land, which is basically the only way out of this is through it, to essentially allow, you know, the system to kind of burn itself out. So how did you come to that conclusion? You know, the idea that this isn't something that can be artificially limited. It has to kind of kill itself.
Well, what I propose is the true difference, like the nature of difference between the soft bioconservatives, that is the people who just want to ban technology for genetic modification with some form of United Nations or something similar, just like international ban, and the people who want to destroy the entire techno-industrial system, is really just the amount of knowledge they have about politics. Like when you don't know how politics works, then everything seems possible. Like to a child, because a child doesn't know anything, everything seems possible. But as you grow older, you become less optimistic. You start to realize, hey, you know, certain things are impossible. Like, for example, when you're an adult, you know for a fact that it will not be the case that tomorrow all politicians will be telling the truth. Like, you just know that much about the world to say, hey, this is not going to happen. And with bioconservatives, I think it's totally like cool for everyone to start as a soft bioconservative, but then as you sort of learn more about politics, you become less optimistic about these solutions using legislation, and you start leaning more towards destroying the whole system. But I don't think we should create some sort of big division between soft bioconservatives and hard bioconservatives. I think we should all just be part of one movement and try soft solutions first. You know, why destroy the whole system before even trying to fix it with legislation? I don't see a problem. And I think as time goes on, more and more people will, to more and more people, it will become obvious that we need to go with hard solution. But I insist that it's not a debate that we need to have right now. We can just agree, hey, you know, let's make sure that human beings continue to exist. And this whole debate about, okay, will we need to destroy the whole system, or will we be able to reform it with laws? You know, it's a debate to have really at another time.
Well, and that's one of the things that you bring up, that essentially this technological process is outside of kind of like the bounds of politics, the bounds of rationality. It's driven primarily through competition. And it's something you see a lot with particularly the Chinese. And this is a difficult issue to talk about because particularly in the US and a lot of English speaking media, there is a lot of anti-Chinese sentiment. You have things like the Epoch Times, which are funded by kind of these odd, shadowy religious groups, and also just the China hawk lobby in general. But at the same time, we can see that areas of research that are not, shall we say, that are not kosher in the West, when it comes to genetic modification, gain of function research, are being pursued in places like China. And the problem is, like you've laid out in your article, it gains you a competitive advantage, right? If you're willing to do that, you will have something that, your opponents don't. And so it does sort of seem like you said, that it is not within the realm of politics to solve that problem, because the best you could hope for is handicapping your civilization.
That is the reason why I insist that bioconservatives should not try to ban this technology at home, but internationally. If it is to have any impact, if it is to have any meaning, it has to be an international ban.
Well, and because of that, it sort of requires a fundamental shift in the way that we view technology. The idea of Faustian civilization, that kind of like eternal struggle against limit, has led to a lot of people kind of subconsciously believing effectively that technology is a good in and of itself. That greater efficiency, greater capacity is always better. And because of that, it's somewhat interesting to watch people, and we'll use the AI debate because it's kind of in the news currently, but to hear people who, and let's be honest, this was 2 years ago now, basically championing, capital T, capital S, the science, basically saying wait, maybe we'll have to, take our foot off the gas. It's been an interesting kind of conflict in the narrative.
If you look 50 years ago, everyone was super certain that scientists are correct. Everyone believed in science. Whereas today, especially younger people, they can see that there's a lot of corruption and bullshit coming out of science. And what is particularly surprising is that up until very recently, up until 2008, the political left was the side that was always talking about how evil corporations are. Big evil corporations just want to make a profit. And the obvious fact is that the kind of experiments that scientists are doing to prove their thesis or to disprove their thesis are mostly funded by really big corporations that are for-profit corporations that are not some sort of institutions dedicated to making world a better place or advancing human knowledge. They are big corporations that are made for profit, and they are the ones who are funding most of the research. And it is fascinating to see that the leftists who were up until 2008 so aware of potential bad motives of big corporations are 100% sure that all of the science that these corporations are funding is legit. And the people who are doubting the science are almost exclusively on the right.
Well, and what's interesting about that is in America in particular, this is a very quick flip. And you can see it when it comes to kind of certain more niche cultural issues. I'll kind of stay away from the big ticket items like COVID or gender, any of that. One of the most interesting ones is diet. So about even just 15 years ago, if you cared about the quality of ingredients in your food, if you cared about food additives, that was a coded left-wing opinion. There were all of these kind of moralizing documentaries that came out, Super Size Me, Forks Over Knives, which were basically saying like dumb conservative rednecks eat bad food, and they're the reason America's one of the fattest countries in the world. So fast forward within my life, and look, I'm in my early 20s. You haven't been around for a long time. And things that used to be for, kind of weird hippies who didn't shower are now right-wing extremists. I'll use an example from my own life. I had someone who I know question me, ask if I was an extremist because I get milk from a local farmer. Like that is something that is, which would have been incredibly normal for, let's be honest, the entirety of human existence, is now coded as extremist. And so my point in that is not to complain about, people I meet in my daily life, but to say that I think it's true that for the left, in many cases, their stated principles weren't principles. They were a tool to get into power. It was convenient to say our enemies are gross and disgusting and eat horrible food. But as soon as they're in charge, it's like, okay, well, their slop might not be McDonald's. It might be, the kind of like meat replacement, egg replacement, milk replacement items. But it's essentially analogous. It's the same thing. It's just higher status socially. And so in that, I do think that it's kind of like that's more just downstream of power. And when you bring up that idea in your essay, that I think is really interesting, that essentially at a certain point you lose that optimism. You're the revolutionary left wing, but you've got into power, as they certainly have, over most of the West. And the utopia you've been promised hasn't materialized. Well, logically, if we're in charge and utopia hasn't, manifested, the problem is in the people, and we have to fix the people. And so that idea of, what in a different era would have been the new Soviet man, right, remaking human nature, has reappeared with much greater access to technology. And now instead of, merely, indoctrinating, changing the organization of the family, which we are doing as well, we've decided let's add another layer of that, which is, the technological. And so there are two forces working at once. One, the kind of drive of techno capital to ever greater efficiency that we've already talked about. But the other one is social. And that's the idea that, humans aren't doing the things we want them to. So we'll have to engineer them. So do you see that trend on the social side of this equation as well?
Yes, and that is exactly the difference between traditional communists and modern extinctionists. The only difference is that communists did not have the idea that technology should be used to modify humans themselves. And that is what extinctionists have decided to do. So people who were communists were utopianists. They had the idea, oh, we are going to build a world without suffering, without oppression, and so on. And the people who were communists never really gave up on building a utopia. They just realized, oh, the reason we don't have utopia, the reason there are so many mistakes in the system is because human beings are imperfect. Human beings have certain flaws, and they cause the problems within the system, and that's why we don't have a utopia. So they did not give up on building a utopia and decide, hey, let's build a system that works for actual human beings. They decided, hey, let's build our utopia anyway and change the human beings as much as we need to, using all this modern technology. And the ones who did decide that they're going to use technology to modify human beings as much as they need to create some kind of high-tech utopia are the ones that I do not call communists, but extinctionists. But they are the same people. They are like they changed their ideology a little bit, but these are, for the most part, the people who were the first extinctionists in the United States are the people who used to be communists. They just changed their ideology a little bit.
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up, because the progressive movement in the US, and when I say that, I'm talking about the 20th century progressive movement, not the current version, although there is a through line, was absolutely obsessed with eugenics. So my area of the country was full of these asylums and different organizations, essentially, where they would, with state funding, and the interesting thing is they try to blame the government for this, but almost every major university in my state, almost every major hospital contributed to these programs, where they would, through kind of crude methods, essentially genetically modify out undesirable parts of the population. And so, you can say that, in a kind of soft sense, eugenic conditions are good, right? Like the society should reward good behavior. That's not what I'm talking about. But the idea that there is an expert in a lab coat who basically, decides you were unfit and therefore must be kind of managed out of the way is a very old one, with, in many cases, the exact same people. These are their grandparents. These are their great-grandparents. And again, the mechanisms of control, the mechanism of management have changed, but it's that same idea that essentially, humans are fungible tokens. There's no difference between you and I except for social factors. And so, well, if humans aren't producing the results we want, which in many cases is this kind of like perfect, fungible egalitarianism where humans are just, interchangeable widgets, well, then they must be made to be that. And so obviously the specific ends to which management has been turned, right, was very different on one side of the Iron Curtain than the other. They were effectively pulling in the same direction.
Yes, and the reason for this is that both the capitalists and the socialists were fans, huge fans, like worshippers of technological progress. And this was best explained by Jacques Ellul. Jacques Ellul, unfortunately, did not give us any good solutions. He also didn't give us a theory that would be very useful for creating some kind of solution. But what he did do is he gave us a conclusion to the debate that has dominated the 20th century, which is the debate between the capitalists and the socialists, the people who want a free market, just corporations acting in their own interest, versus the people who want a centrally managed economy where government decides money is going to be allocated to this and that. And I would like to get a little bit into how Ellul finished that debate, if you don't mind.
No, sure. I'm all ears.
So if you look at the mainstream debates, the capitalists always complain, hey, socialism doesn't work, it's not efficient. And they always cite these early examples of socialism, or the examples where it's some small country that has suffered from US embargo. But really, what Ellul is saying is, yes, when you have a kind of society like the early America was, with like when America was founded, something like 90% of people were doing subsistence agriculture. In that kind of society, yes, centrally managed economy, just, it's terrible for efficiency. However, as the society becomes more technologically advanced, and as it collects data from how economy is managed, it slowly becomes more efficient. So what you will see, yes, like socialism was economically a disaster when Bolsheviks took over. However, this is because it's in very early stages and because it's a country that was not very industrialized. But over time, what Ellul predicted is that as the sheer scale of business gets larger and larger, central management will become more efficient. And we can see that that's true now. Big corporations in the United States are technically capitalist. I mean, they're legally private. However, they are being centrally managed. And in the Soviet Union, after like the first something like 5 years of Bolshevik rule, they decided to make it a little bit more capitalist, allowed just decentralize the economy a little bit. But over time, it still got more centrally managed. And this is something we see actually all over the world. There is increase in the central management as the technology advances, as the scale of production increases, and as the experts of economy collect data about how to run that economy. And so Ellul was saying, eventually, like central management of economy is going to become more efficient, period. Like, yeah, capitalists are right that at some point, allowing people to manage their own affairs was more efficient, but in the future, central management is going to be more efficient. And that's pretty much the conclusion to the debate. And the debate still goes on, but it goes on between people who did not read Ellul. Like the people who have read Ellul, they never start debating capitalism versus socialism. They just see, okay, this debate is done. What next?
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up, because that same dynamic of technological creep through competition that you describe in kind of the modification of the human animal, you see in the economy, right? That effectively things like fiat currency, a central bank, the ability to kind of manage the price of money and the money supply were kind of too good to pass up. Like, you needed those things, because when you have that, you can essentially do things that people who haven't developed that economic technology can't. And it's one of those things where it's like, sure, in the long run, that may be a maladaptation. It may hurt you in the long run. It doesn't matter, because you'll win any short-term conflict with another system. And it's interesting, you bring up that the kind of like, and I have read some Ellul. I've read Propaganda, and then I've read a lot of Kaczynski, which is essentially Ellul with mail bombs. And it's interesting because I came to many of these same ideas not through that route, but through James Burnham, who describes that system of managerialism, the idea that that kind of rule by efficiency, rule by the expert. You essentially, even if you start off in radically different ideological camps, like the Germans, the Americans, and the Russians did, effectively give it long enough and it becomes the same thing over time. Efficiency kind of pulls in one way. And I agree with you, like looking at things as capitalism versus socialism is just backwards. It's why people that used to be very influential, people like, Ron Paul, who I still have a great deal of respect for, but it's why they've kind of fallen by the wayside. They're using an outdated and outmoded system of analysis. And so you get, these kind of odd takes, like you've seen a lot of this with the ANCAP elected in Argentina, where it's like, people don't know where to put that anymore, because that kind of traditional, I guess, division between capitalist and socialist, it's not really, it doesn't matter anymore. It's sort of an old paradigm.
Exactly. And Ellul pointed out that both the capitalists and socialists have as their goal technological progress, economic growth, and efficiency. These are, and he says, these are the real holy cows of all the societies, whether they be capitalist or socialist. These are the things that that cannot be questioned. And he, Ellul says, in our society, everything can be questioned, God first of all, but you cannot question that society should be as efficient as possible. Like if you try to question it, people will look at you weird, treat you like you are antisocial, like there's something wrong with you.
Well, and it's interesting because I notice this very clearly with people like the kind of like the rationalists, the atheists, because they try to kind of backfill that same series of values, and you end up with things like human flourishing, you know, which is this idea that there is, and you see it kind of downstream of Jeremy Bentham, you know, that you can mathematically calculate a good life, you know, an optimal amount of consumption, and then manage that. And so it's kind of played out to its absurd end game with, you know, people like Klaus Schwab, the WF types, where it's essentially this idea of the human as this, you know, this kind of battery that you can stick in a pod. And as long as he has all of his kind of, you know, lizard brain, you know, brainstem level desires met, that will be a good and meaningful life. And again, it does go back to that idea of, you know, Bentham's panopticon, you know, where it is this kind of like fully managed society, but because it is the most optimized answer for those questions you mentioned, excuse me, it's horrifying on an instinctual level, but it is the logical conclusion, I guess.
Yes, it is the logical conclusion of liberal values. The disagreement between capitalism and socialism was never about what the goal is. The disagreement was merely about which means are most appropriate to reach that goal. And of course, as the time goes on, we get more and more data about what works, which methods work. And of course, over time, the capitalist and socialist liberals, as long as they are reviewing the data, as long as they are in touch with reality, of course, they will eventually come to more or less the same position. They will come to agree mostly about everything. And that is what is happening right now. And what I am saying is, in order to be bioconservatives, we need to reject liberalism as a whole. We can't be either socialists or capitalists, because these are both versions of liberalism and outdated versions of liberalism. The only liberalism we have today as a sort of dominant ideology that's actually being implemented is the progressive liberalism. And if we want to oppose the current thing, if we want something different, we have to oppose liberalism as a whole. I don't think advocating for some earlier version of liberalism leads to anything productive, because the earlier versions of liberalism made sense in the earlier stages of technological progress. We have modern technology, we have technology that we do today, and some of the older versions of liberalism just don't quite work with the modern technology. So some people want to like make women housewives like they were in 1950s. Well, that's not exactly efficient with today's technology. And if you want to have something different than what we have today, you really need to give up on liberalism as a whole. And there is another reason that bioconservatives cannot be liberals. So in the liberal system of values, if someone has any kind of problem that is causing them discomfort or any kind of illness, you have to immediately help them. Like, you don't ask, okay, like, how did it get this way? If I help them, what are the long-term consequences? Like, you are, as a liberal, you're supposed to immediately help those who are suffering, regardless if they deserved that suffering or not. And the technology for artificial genetic enhancement is being marketed as gene therapy. It's being marketed as something that will help people who are extremely disadvantaged by some unfortunate circumstance that is beyond their control. And this is the problem that comes in the writing of Michael Sandel. So Michael Sandel wrote a book called A Case Against Perfection, where he gives a bunch of reasons why we should not genetically enhance human beings. But because he is a liberal, he has to say, well, of course, I support the gene therapy. Therapy is fine, just not enhancement. However, the problem is there are no separate tools for gene therapy and gene enhancement. We are talking about using one same tool, and the only question is, how far do you go? So it is completely impractical to ban genetic enhancement, but to keep the genetic therapy going. So in order to understand it, I'm just going to give you a metaphor. Like, imagine we want to prevent people from getting drunk, and so the government decides, hey, you know, we're not gonna ban alcohol. Like, our goal is to prevent people from getting drunk, but we're not going to ban alcohol. We are just going to legislate, like, how much you can drink. Like, of course, that's not going to work. Like, if the government says, okay, like, you can drink exactly this amount of milliliters, and of course, like, some people are going to drink more than that. And the reason that doesn't work with genetic enhancement is because, unlike with alcohol, you never get sober, right? If you drink alcohol, the next day you're still the same after you have a good sleep. But with the genetic enhancement technology, all the changes are permanent. So if someone gets a gene therapy, and this actually happened, like, there was some sports guy, he got gene therapy, and his ability actually got enhanced. And these are the things that are inevitably going to happen in smaller or bigger measure. Now, the next problem with just allowing the therapy is that, well, as everyone gets to a certain point, as in the future in which everyone is getting gene therapy to make sure that they're not below the certain baseline, there is hardly any reason not to raise that baseline. Like, a government can say, hey, you know, we can improve efficiency by enhancing everyone. And of course, the liberals will agree, because if others are not getting unfair competitive advantage, then what's the problem? Why not just enhance everyone to be better and boost the economy and increase efficiency?
Well, and there's something that Kaczynski brings up as well, and like I've said, he was a student of Lul, where fixing things, improving efficiency is sort of a trap, right? That this system is kind of evolved to a level to which your available tools of resistance, and in his essay, The System's Greatest Trick, this is kind of his idea, is that any available resistance to you, right? So he uses the example of different social causes that are kind of presented as rebellious. What essentially you are doing is you are acting in such a way to increase the efficiency of the system. You are making it better. And so if you follow these kind of predetermined routes of rebellion, right, you're kind of pre-packaged ways to express your discontent, all you're doing is strengthening the thing as a whole. And so I'm curious, right? You've kind of mentioned again and again that this is, you know, this creep from therapy to modification. It is essentially one and the same thing. So
yeah,
just I have to ask this because it's a burning question: is will people like us, if we decide I will not modify myself, will we be at a significant disadvantage socially in the job, in the workplace, because of the fact that we are kind of unmodified?
Sure, that would be the case if we made that decision. However, bioconservative ideology does not entail being against modifying yourself, but it entails banning the genetic modification internationally. And one of the key factors that we need in order to make this legislation happen is we cannot attack the people who did it, because it's going to be the ultra rich, it's going to be the people who are on very top of society, and the masses attacking the people who are on top doesn't work. Rather, in order for it to work, it has to be, hey, whoever got it, but we're going to ban it because it's for the good of humanity as a whole. And the people who already got it, of course, they have some competitive advantage. And if others get it as well, then they will lose their competitive advantage. And that gives the incentive for them, for the people who are extremely wealthy, to actually support our movement, which is necessary for it to succeed.
All right, thank you. You tie that up well. So how do you see that the traditional right is unable to meet this challenge? We've talked a lot about the left and kind of the different factions of the left, but it seems like the right wing is equally as complicit in this, even though they are no longer the ideology of power.
I think the mainstream right wing is losing adherents. The people who are a mainstream right wing are mostly boomers. There are people who are retired or about to retire. Zoomers, the young people, they are very cynical about ideology. They're just not buying it.
Definitely. I think that it's interesting because you go back to that frame that we talked about of capitalism versus socialism, is the frame of the Cold War. And at least in the Anglosphere, the right has never moved on from the Cold War. It's very concerned with things like defense spending. It's very concerned with kind of Thatcherite or Reaganite economics. And so whereas the left has changed very significantly since the 1970s and the 1980s, there are similar principles, but the system, the power players are different. The right has kind of ossified, it's turned to bone. And I think that because of that inability to adapt, they have kind of rightfully fallen, from their kind of like level of cultural significance. And it's interesting, you bring up that, again, that concept of efficiency as being the one ruling thing. That, look, like, I am not a populist, but in watching these populists in the US with people like Trump or kind of across, the European Union, they often face their strongest pushback from the center right. We think of like the Christian Democrat movement kind of across like Western Europe, or in the US, people like, the neocons, is they're very, very quick to bring up this fact that, even a fairly milquetoast opposition to never-ending efficiency is almost heresy to them. Listen to the way that they talk about, like, as the people in the UK have been dealing with, their massive migrant crisis, right? It's the idea that if you restrict this even back to levels of, Tony Blair in the early 2000s, well, it'll be apocalyptic. We can't go back. And I think that core premise that one, technology, progress, efficiency is an endless good, and also that essentially to go back or to do anything different is inconceivable. I mean, I really think that's the idea that has to die at the center of this.
Yes, neocons are liberals in the sense of the original sense of the word. They are liberals, And bioconservatives can be liberals, and I don't think we should try to convert neocon politicians and neocon talking heads. I think we should just compete with them for the audience. Just make sure that young people are joining a bioconservative movement and not the neocon movement, and just outcompete them and let their thing die. Now, the reason these moderate liberals like neocons are trying so hard to take any opportunity to attack people who are further on the right than they are is because extinctionists have power and money, and they are getting money from extinctionists. Although, like, neocons are opposing some aspects of the system, they are kind of attacking establishment a little bit, but in the end they are getting their money from extinctionists, and so they can't attack the actual ideology of extinctionists. They can only attack the excesses of it. They can attack some sort of they can attack some form of wokeness that doesn't really serve the mainline extinctionist ideology. And this, I think, this has become extremely obvious, like especially with Nikki Haley, neocon, a few days ago, saying like, "Oh yeah, like 12-year-olds should receive gender industry products." So yeah, like I think the people are, at least in America, like I think people have realized, hey, you know, neocons are not really opposition.
No, I think you're right. I think that, you know, and not to be too extreme on this, but I think that is a problem that will be solved with the day of the pillow. You know, you're essentially seeing it being solved in real terms. Now, the question is, right, is that will opposition be redirected? Because what you're seeing in the US, and I can't speak to elsewhere, is that a lot of this dissident energy is being captured by people like Peter Thiel, people like Musk, and a faction that is very interested in increasing efficiency. That one of the things that I think may cause the woke movement, not the broader system, I don't consider them to be synonymous, to be put away, is that idea of bio-Leninism. So bio-Leninism, for those who aren't familiar, is an idea from a blogger named Spandrel, that essentially there is a lot of short-term political power to be gained from artificially placing low-status people into high-status roles. And he says that this is happening in the US with affirmative action, with different rules with the civil rights law, and bio-Leninism, because Lenin himself did this. You know, he put a lot of, I mean, there's no secret to the fact that a lot of high-ranking Soviet officials were members of groups, minority groups that the previous Russian government had not been kind to. And so my point in bringing this up is you sort of wonder if a lot of that opposition is essentially a desire to create a more efficient system, right? A system without affirmative action, a system without, you know, this kind of like endless social pandering would work better. And people like Musk, who is very explicitly a transhumanist, you know, he wants to create Neuralink. I wonder if that's their kind of path to power, and almost if the next thing to come out of the quote unquote right is almost more direct than the current crop of extinctionists we see.
I do think that the establishment is trying to capture dissident energy, and I think the only way that we, the dissident right, can compete with the establishment's phony opposition is by preaching bioconservatism. I think the question, like, what should the dissident right be even uniting around? Like, what should be the core of the movement? I think the bioconservatism is the only reasonable option. I'm not saying that everyone in the dissident right needs to become a bioconservative to become a true believer. What I'm saying is that everyone in the dissident right should preach bioconservatism, like regardless whether they are particularly excited about that the whole project, or whether they are secretly a transhumanist. It's just it's the only thing that you can really sell to the large audience, to the large audience of normies. And if you look at the alternatives that get thrown around, like Christian nationalism, well, most of the Christians don't support Christian nationalism, and you obviously can't sell it to anyone who is not a Christian. So Christian nationalism is something that can be sold to a number of people, and maybe there can be created a Christian nationalist state within the United States, like one of the 50, but it's not the kind of ideology that can be used for some kind of international change of regime, because the current regime, the Extinctionists, they are an international regime. They're not just in one state. And in order to replace them, in order to remove them from power, we have to have an ideology that has an international appeal, and Christian nationalism is just not that. White nationalism, it's not that either. Like something like 13% of the world is white, and like that count, in that 13% are also people who hate white people. And you obviously can't sell white nationalism to anyone who isn't white. So that's obviously like a non-starter. I think the only ideology that I don't think there are any serious competitors. Like if we want to replace the current establishment, the current international establishment, I think preaching bioconservatism is the way to go, and it's the only reasonable option.
Well, I think you did a very good job expressing your beliefs on that. I'm convinced. I enjoyed it. So if people want to read more of your work, what's a good way for them to do that?
Resistanceprotocols.com, and you click on contact page. The reason I am suggesting it like this is because on any kind of social media website, we can get banned, right? Like a lot of people in our sphere like Substack nowadays, but Substack can just decide one day, hey, let's ban these people. So the reason I am always pointing people to the contact page of my website is because it's always going to be there. It's the most permanent thing. Like no one can ban us from there except ISP, which ISP bans do not exist to the current day.
Well, great. And thank you so much for appearing on my show. I appreciate your time.
Thank you for inviting me. It was great.
And to everyone at home, if you're looking to support my show, you can find it on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, whatever podcatcher you like to use. If you want to support me more directly, check out my sponsor, Axios Fitness. Just started a new block of programming. I'm doing really well at it, enjoying it a lot. And if you want to check it out, I'd really appreciate it. And to everyone at home, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Good night.